Hello, today we're looking at I Wanna Be Yours, a very unconventional love poem by a very unconventional poet, John Cooper Clarke. Now, as much as I adore this poem, it is not going to be a loving homage to the text, this video. No, rather it's going to be a smash and grab job. I'm going to dive in, pull out a couple of features of language, a couple of features of structure, maybe a few contextual details, and then I'm going to marry all that up together into the kind of high-grade exam paragraph that's going to have the examiner clapping till his knuckles rattle. Now here's a brief overview of the poem to re-familiarise yourself with the text. Over 3 stanzas, or verses, the narrator employs several metaphors to assert his desire to be useful, intimate, like physically close, and protective towards a possible or prospective lover. There's a predominantly fixed rhyme scheme, although there's a bit of a curveball in the final stanza, which we'll talk about later. And the poem's imagery, these metaphors, draw on objects that you wouldn't traditionally associate with love. Perhaps the kind of objects you'd normally associate with love would be things like hearts and flowers. But John Cooper Clarke, being a bit of a curveball himself, he's cited objects such as vacuum cleaners, raincoats and electric meters. Now, I don't claim to be a beauty pageant contestant myself, but it's fair to say that John Cooper Clarke can be best described, I think, as looking like a malnourished zombie. He's whippet thin, shockingly gaunt. He's never going to be the poster boy for Dove moisturiser. He's got this big shock of black hair, thick black sunglasses, big battered nose, and a kind of very stylish suit. A real gift to amateur cartoonists like myself. It's fair to say with John Cooper Clarke that hard living, I think he was a heroin addict for a good decade, possibly more, has left its mark. And I've laid on some contextual information here because I know exam boards increasingly force students to look at details about the poet's life, details about the era when the poem was written when they're analysing the texts. So here we are. John Cooper Clarke was born in Manchester in 1949. He was known as the Bard of Salford. Salford's a borough of Manchester. He was known as a punk poet because he became a well-known poet during the punk era, the tail end of the 1970s. Moreover, I would argue that the values of John Cooper Clarke that you see presented in this poem are shaped by the permissive 1960s. This is when Western societies, I'm talking generally about America and England, embraced more liberal, less moral attitudes towards sex and relationships. First language technique then. This poem employs informal language. There's a refrain, a line repeated at the end of each stanza, and that line is, I wanna be yours. And obviously wanna is informal language. You wouldn't say it in front of the Queen, it's not standard English, it's not formal. So what we'll do now with this dinky line, I wanna be yours, is we're going to pull out 2 interpretations, because an index, a watermark, a sign of a high-level student is one who can evaluate language. And one way that you evaluate language is by laying on more than one interpretation, kind of showing alternative ways of reading the line. I'm also going to try and see if I can create a relevant contextual link to this line as well. Now, my first interpretation for that line, I want to be yours, is going to link directly to social context, because I'm saying that Clarke's use of this informal language reflects the non-conformity to tradition, to the old ways, that characterises the values of punk. Values that I think are nicely summed up by my goofy little cartoon there. You can think of the punk era as a time when young people were promoting really strong anti-establishment views in a very aggressive way. They didn't want people like me, teachers, doctors, lawyers, politicians, prime ministers, what they call the establishment or the system, controlling and oppressing them and snatching away their freedom. I dare say, like a lot of my students, punks would have been queuing up to headbutt somebody like me. And don't forget that in terms of love poetry, tradition or the old ways would mean a more formal tone of delivery. That's the tradition that Cooper Clarke is rebelling against here. Mr. Taylor, I can't help thinking sometimes that your videos might just be a cry for help. Why on earth are you drawing a very excited looking wolf looking at an attractive woman? What the hell has that got to do with informal language in I Want to Be Yours? Let me try and explain. I don't know if you've ever seen those Looney Tunes cartoons where the wolf's at the nightclub and this attractive dancer gets on stage and obviously he finds her very attractive and he starts going bonkers. His eyes balloon from his head, his tongue thunks out onto the table, he starts howling, hammering the table with a chair, sometimes even tonks himself over the head with a mallet. In short, the wolf loses control big time. And I would argue that something not dissimilar happens in this poem, I Want to Be Yours. The informal tone, the informal register, the informal lexis, call it what you will, that signifies a loss of control by the narrator due to the overwhelming passion he feels towards the woman. Now forget about love and lust for a second. If you've ever heard your teacher let slip with a swear word, I suspect that was when they were overwhelmed by another emotion, probably anger or frustration. Sometimes we lose control when we're overcome by powerful sensation or emotion. And that means that we forget and we don't observe the conventions of polite discourse. The other language technique we'll explore in this video is metaphor. As I said before, this poem is a party bag of metaphors, presenting the poet's feelings and linking them to objects not traditionally associated with love. And John Cooper Clarke, in his nasal Mancunian accent, gives it lines like, "Let me be your vacuum cleaner, breathing in your dust. Let me be your Ford Cortina, I will never rust." And then he rolls out, "If you like your coffee hot, I could be your coffee pot." And for that final coffee-related metaphor, we're going to go on to pull out two interpretations, again, to evaluate the image. First off, the coffee metaphor, that reference to hot coffee, serves to convey the narrator's wish to provide emotional warmth to the woman. That would be, if you like, our PG certificate interpretation. But of course there's a racier interpretation to this line, because hot can refer to somebody being sexually attractive, as is the case in my oh so hilarious picture here. That reference to hot coffee then as a sexual connotation. Hot alludes to his wish to be sexually intimate with this woman. And I guess if you really want to drill down in this image, coffee is a stimulant, which might suggest that he wants to stimulate her. Now I know that sounds crude and a bit cheesy. I guarantee that is a legitimate, very insightful interpretation of that line. On to structure now. This poem consistently uses enjambement, which means there's no full stop at the end of the line to slow down the flow of the poem. In general then, enjambement creates pace, because you don't have to pause at the end of the line. And in this poem, in this case, what that pace does is it helps to capture the narrator's passionate feelings towards the woman. The other structural technique that we'll look at is the fixed AB, AB, CCC rhyme scheme, which prevails through all three stanzas. That said, in the last stanza, there is a slight deviation from that rigid form. An easy win for analysing this fixed rhyme scheme, I would argue that it conveys his unswerving devotion to the woman. But as I say, Cooper Clarke upsets that fixed rhyme scheme in the final stanza towards the end. He throws in an extra line. He says, "I don't want to be hers," just before that refrain, "I want to be yours." And as I've tried to do throughout this video, we're going to take that line which undermines or upsets the fixed rhyme scheme of the poem, that line, "I don't want to be hers," and we're going to see if we can pull out a multiplicity of meanings, two interpretations. First off, we can view this line quite romantically, "I don't want to be hers," because it might just be the narrator rejecting other women. He's renouncing other women. He only has eyes for the woman he's addressing in the poem. Alas, there is a more cynical alternative interpretation to this line, which suggests that the narrator is wishing to leave his current partner in favour of the woman he's addressing in the poem. In a sense, he's after an upgrade. He wants to ditch his current partner and get with this new girl. In terms of context, of social context, we could link this line to the punk era, because it's pretty unconventional to refer to other women in traditional love poetry. In general, you're trying to get across in a love poem how much you love one girl, and conducive to that endeavour or that effort is not to mention other women. But do you remember earlier on I talked about John Cooper Clarke being a product of the permissive 1960s, when arguably society became more liberal in its attitudes towards sex and relationships. Divorce became more acceptable. There was legislation in Britain which meant homosexuality became legal, and the pill meant that people could have premarital sex without the risk of pregnancy. In short then, Cooper Clarke's reference to this other woman, I don't want to be hers, could be seen as reflecting his more casual attitude towards sex, a casual attitude ushered in by this permissive 1960s. Permissive meaning allowing or accepting, being more tolerant. So we've had a look at the poem's language, we've had a look at its structure, we've had a look at some of the contextual factors underpinning the poem. Now what we're going to do is to shape some of those ideas into a high-level exam paragraph. Now the little picture here shows Mr. Taylor coughing up an A star. Now I know that in Britain the system has changed, you no longer have A star to G, you've got 1 to 9, but I believe in minimising my carbon footprint, so I'm going to roll out this old picture. But anyway, I'm going to turn my ideas now into a high-quality exam or essay paragraph. Feast your eyes on that beauty. I'll read it through once and then I'll just explain why I've underlined certain things in yellow. This is bringing your attention to some of the tricks or techniques that I'm employing to ensure the highest marks. Here we go then. In I Want to Be Yours, Clarke deviates slightly from the regular rhyme scheme in his final stanza. The fixed ABABCCC rhyme scheme effectively emphasises to the reader the unswerving devotion the narrator feels towards the woman. However, the extra line in stanza 3, before the refrain of I Want to Be Yours, reads, I don't want to be hers. This implies a previous or current relationship with another woman. So let's very briefly deconstruct now why this is such a soul-meltingly good paragraph. Well, for a start, I've employed the PEE format. Perhaps we have a different acronym, but it generally means I've made a point, I've backed it up with evidence, that's the P and the E, point evidence, and then I've explained the effect of that evidence. What is the writer trying to say? What is the writer trying to show? What is the writer trying to do? In the first line, the point, I refer to the poetic technique that the poet employs, this slight deviation from a regular or a fixed rhyme scheme. My evidence, well, it'll be a proper div if I wrote down the whole stanza to kind of support that point. You don't have to do that, of course you don't have to do that. Just say what the rhyme scheme is. I've said it's a fixed ABABCCC rhyme scheme. I've underlined effectively because I know the exam board I'm with, EdExcel, asks students to evaluate language, to kind of cast judgment on how well a poet creates a poem. So effectively, powerfully, engagingly, intriguingly, these are all adverbs that are evaluative, that cast judgment on the poem. The rhyme scheme effectively emphasises to the reader, again my exam board at Excel asks you to explicitly say to the reader, to make explicit that the effect the poet is after is on the reader. So I've said emphasises to the reader the unswerving devotion the narrator feels towards the woman. That's my explanation. However, this is a connective launching my deeper analysis because of course I'm looking at that deviation in the rhyme scheme, and I've just given a little explanation there as to what the effect of that deviation from the fixed rhyme scheme is. I won't bother reading this bit out, but this continues that first paragraph by linking the poem to relevant contextual details. So feel free to pause this slide and have a good goggle on what I'm doing there to make a relevant connection between the text, the poem, and some contextual features. The next paragraphs that come up, I won't bother reading out, I won't bother explaining. They are highlighted, so feel free to consider why I've drawn your attention to certain features of the paragraph. What are the aspects of best practice here that I'm trying to hammer into you? And here they are. 2 paragraphs, analysing language, forging 2 interpretations, and linking to relevant contextual factors. Have a read. And that's us, folks. Just one last fascinating fact before we go. My students tell me that this poem, I Want to Be Yours, has been covered by a pop band. I think they're called the Frosty Chimps or the Arctic Monkeys or something. Apparently they're very well regarded, and it's a song well worth checking out. No doubt you can dig it up on YouTube's databanks.